Okay, good afternoon. I see it's, or good morning, depending upon where you are. It's 1 minute after the hour. So we have a packed agenda, so I don't want to delay us any further. So as folks are joining in, and we have a large number of folks joining in on this Friday before a holiday weekend. So welcome, everybody. Get this out of the way. So welcome to Bridging HIV and Substance Use Disorder Innovations in the Field series. This is sponsored by NAHUD, the National Alliance for HIV Education and Workforce Development. And NAHUD is a membership organization of the 8 regional and 2 national AIDS education and training centers, or the AETCs. And we support the AETC program mission. NAHUD was established in 2010. It supports the AETCs, which are a component of the HRSA-funded Ryan White program. We collaborate with many organizations in order to promote and educate on the work of the AETC program. But since 2018, we have been funded by the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry as a partner organization of the Opioid Response Network, or ORN, to address the intersection of HIV and opioid use and other substance use disorder. ORN was created to support efforts in addressing prevention, treatment, and recovery of opioid use disorder, and provides free resources and technical assistance locally in communities across the United States and all its territory. And you can visit the ORN website for more information and even to submit a request for technical assistance and further training. So we are accrediting this program, and you'll get a survey that will be emailed to you and must be completed within 2 weeks of the completion of the program. There are CME, as well as nursing and social work, or you can also just get a certificate of attendance. There will be a link in the participant chat towards the end of the session as well for this. Again, please, we appreciate your evaluation. Whether or not you are receiving CME credits, we really like to hear your opinion. So please complete the evaluation that you receive. Okay, let me stop sharing and introduce our speaker for today, who is Dr. Martin McElhenney. I'm going to say it right. McElhenney.
You're darn close, Daria. I appreciate it.
And I have nerve with my name, not being able to pronounce somebody else's. Dr. Martin is an assistant professor of clinical medical psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University, and also a research scientist at the New York State Psych Institute. Most of his career has been spent understanding the intersection of medical illnesses such as HIV and the diagnosis and treatment of psychiatric conditions, including depression and substance use. His early work included conducting randomized clinical trials of novel antidepressants, such as testosterone and DHEA in people with HIV. He has served as both principal investigator as co-investigator on several studies, and he is currently working as a therapist on 3 studies investigating the use of ketamine to enhance mindfulness-based therapies for the treatment of substance use disorders. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction, Daria. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my slides with you. I'm hoping that that's visible to people. Again, thank you for this opportunity to speak on, about methamphetamine use in the MSM community and its relation to HIV. And I appreciate everyone on a Friday before a long weekend joining the seminar today to learn more about this topic. I'm going to be, let's see, there we go. Okay, a couple disclosures, no financial disclosures to report, no conflicts of interest. And I will discuss some non-FDA approved treatments during the talk. Let me just give a quick outline. We're going to talk briefly some basics about methamphetamine, its history, some substance use trends in the US. We'll address patterns, methods and patterns of meth use, how it affects the brain, short and long-term effects of meth use. All of these things, my purpose in understanding these and learning a little bit about them is so that we can better help the people who come to us with a meth use disorder. If we understand something about how it affects the brain, patterns of use, I think we could better understand the position that our clients are in. So we'll talk about patterns of use by MSMs. I'm going to talk about a book called Lust, Men, and Meth, and the connection between meth and MSMs and how it intersects with sexual activities. And then talk about how to engage clients who want to change their use. Mostly addressing motivational interviewing as a way of engaging people in treatment and understanding where they are and what changes they'd like to make. And then I'll touch on other treatments, behavioral treatments, and medication trials. So just to start off, what is methamphetamine? Amphetamines are a family of synthetic stimulants that exist in 3 chemical forms. There's amphetamine sulfate, benzodrine, speed. Those are substances that you might be familiar with. Dextroamphetamine, dexedrine, Adderall, which is prescribed for ADHD, is something that we're familiar with. We've seen that prescribed. It's prescribed quite a bit. And then there's methamphetamine, which is the 3rd type of amphetamine. And it's in the form of methadone, which was prescribed in the 50s for weight loss and depression. Disoxin, still in production, it's prescribed for ADHD and weight loss. And then there's crystal methamphetamine, which is a crystalline solid. And that's really what I'm going to be talking most about today, is crystal meth. I included this slide that shows us the chemical structure of amphetamine and methamphetamine, just so you can see the slight differences between those two. And also you'll notice across the top are 3 different neurotransmitters. And you could see the structure of the molecule of methamphetamine and those 3 neurotransmitters. There's some similarities there, and it's probably why methamphetamine is so effective in changing the neurotransmitter makeup of the brain during use. I also included the slide just to make my organic chemistry professor from back in the 80s happy with me for remembering these things. I'm including the standard slide that shows a picture of crystal meth, what it looks like, and some of the street names. It's known by various things, by various names, depending on where you are and which culture you're in. Crystal is common in New York City. How it became Tina and then T. Some argue that it was called Crystal, then Christina, and then got shortened to Tina, and then T. Glass ice, crank, meth are not as common. Well, meth is common in New York, but really, I think Crystal and Tina are probably the most common names in the clients I work with here in New York. Brief history of it, it was first synthesized by a German chemist in the late 1800s. In the late 30s, it was used during World War II to, you could imagine, in order to combat fatigue and increase alertness or even thought aggressiveness in soldiers, that methamphetamine was used during the war. Another date that's important is 2005. The US Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Act, which made it difficult to buy pseudoephedrine, which is an ingredient used to make meth. This made it harder for some of the smaller labs that were springing up around the country to make small batches of meth. What happened as a result of that is the production of meth has really shifted south of the border, and in fact has created larger labs that are making meth. Interestingly, those larger labs are using kind of a different way of producing meth. And the result of that is it tends to be strong. It's a different enantiomer of the meth that was made using pseudoephedrine, and it tends to be a stronger version, unfortunately. So that's what tends to be circulating these days, is maybe a slightly enhanced version of meth that, as compared to the labs that were around the country in the 2000s. 3 periods of increase have been noted in the US. In the 50s, when it was prescribed for weight loss and depression, it was used quite a bit and perhaps misused then by students and so forth. In the late 60s, there's an increased availability of an injectable form, which worsened the abuse potential. So late 60s, there's also a period of increased use. The current wave of increase, some would argue, began in the 1990s. And really, I think started out west, and you'll see in a moment, I'm going to show you a slide that shows it's really kind of started out west and has moved east over time. I've included this slide from SAMHSA, and it's data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and it's data presented from 2020. And it shows for each of the different substances, the line at the top is someone who, reporting use during their lifetime. The green line in the middle is used in the last year. And then the kind of the gray blue line below that is used in the last month. And it's interesting just to note where methamphetamine falls relative to other substances. You could see that 5.6% lifetime. And you can just, it's interesting to compare that, say, with cocaine, another stimulant, not an amphetamine, but another type of stimulant. So about a third as many compared to cocaine lifetime. In terms of last month, they're not so different. There's cocaine at 7%, and I'm sorry, 0.7%, and 0.6 for methamphetamine. Of note here is to look at the relationship between use during the last year and use during the last month. And we could notice, for example, heroin, if you used, now these are different people, so I think we have to be careful here, but used last year 0.3% versus used last month 0.2. So not a big difference there. People who use sometimes during the past year, just in terms of sampling, it probably also people are using more regularly and used in the last month. Same with methamphetamine, sorry, which is different, say, than ecstasy. People might use that kind of differently and may have different addictive qualities to it, addictive uses than methamphetamine, and why the numbers differ between last month versus last year. You could see LSD, quite a big difference between people who, there's used last year. So people will use it occasionally versus using it regularly, or, used it last month is 0.2%. So it's just, this is very kind of, I'm using this data in kind of an awkward way, but just trying to understand the relationship between substances and how they use. This might take me to a slight detour in terms of how addictive different substances are. And it's interesting, I looked and looked and looked at if there's data in terms of, for those who use methamphetamine casually, what proportion end up using in a misuse pattern. And I didn't find data on that. There is data in terms of other substances. Alcohol, say, the data suggests that 4% of people who try it eventually, or who use alcohol eventually, or come to use it in a misuse pattern. Heroin much higher. So I think most of us would understand that heroin has a higher addictive aspect to it. Now, whether it's the chemical nature of the substance, how it's used, and various other aspects that may play into that, we need to think about. But I can't give you an idea of literally how the proportion of people who try meth who end up becoming, I'll use the term addicted, or who end up misusing it. In terms of use, this is data from SAMHSA, again, showing trends from 2016 to 2019. And it's broken, you can see the different lines represent the different years, and it's broken into 3 different age groups from 12 to 17, pretty stable use across those 4 years. 18 to 25, there's a little bit of a bump there in 2017. But notice the pattern for 26 or older, it seems to be marching upwards in terms of the proportion of people using, or the number of people using. I'm sorry that there's not data that shows kind of the upper end or breaks the 26 or older into other groups. It seems that there's an older group, say in their 40s and 50s, who are using meth in a higher proportion. So lumping them all together, as this data does, may not actually give us some of the ideas of trends across age groups. This slide I've included because it shows the prevalence of methamphetamine use by MSMs in 3 different cities in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City in the years from 2004 through to 2017. It's lagging behind a bit, the data. This is from the National HIV Behavioral Surveillance Study, and it's gay men who reported using meth during the last year. And you could see 2004, the numbers were, very high. San Francisco, the highest, Los Angeles second, and then New York. And across those three cities, it dropped, fairly significantly from 2004 to 2008. And that may have to do with a couple of things. That spans the year when ephedrine was made more challenging to buy in quantities in order to produce meth. So the supply chain might have altered during that period. That may have affected this to some degree. In New York City in particular, there's a big ad campaign going on in New York City during that time to combat what was seen as a trend towards use in the gay community. And so there are bus stop ads, all sorts of ads suggesting the challenges that meth can produce, the relationship between meth and HIV. There was a bus stop that said, use crystal meth and get HIV free. There are ads like that around the city. Some argue that this data that shows the decrease might be actual numbers, but actually that there is a certain amount of shame in people using during that period because of the negative press it was getting. So some argue that perhaps people were just less likely to report. They felt some shame about reporting. So what that trend is tricky to tease out, but something was happening during that phase. Unfortunately, we can see that it's kind of bouncing back up to 2017. I think we will hopefully get some data from that behavioral surveillance study to see where it's heading more recently. This is data for those 18 years and older, and this is from the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report from March 2020. And this is asking people to report on their past year use from 2015 to 2018. What's useful to notice here is it gives us a little bit of a sense of how people use. You could see down across here is the percentage among adults using methamphetamine in the past year and kind of how they're using. You can see that there are people reporting using greater than 200 days of use. Is the second longest bar going across here to about 25%. It drops in the middle here between 100 and 199 days, and then 30 to 99. And then the bar, actually the longest bar, which is more like in the mid 30s in terms of percentages, is 1 to 29 days of use during the past year. So there's kind of an interesting pattern going on here. Those who might use occasionally, once a month, a couple times a month, some people who use in the in-between range, and then those who use kind of very frequently. Those who meet criteria for methamphetamine use disorder, 50% receiving treatment, there it is at about 30%. Methamphetamine injection, I'll be talking in a moment about how it's generally the root of use. I think for the most part, people smoke meth, but injection seems to be on the rise. And I think we need more data, more information on kind of the difference between smoking meth and injecting. What people described to me, and someone who I was working with for a period of time, he was a medical doctor who became, got into using meth, and he described his pattern, which went from smoking to injection, and he said it was a very different type of experience when injecting, and he talks about it almost as if it's two different substances between the different routes of use. We have more to learn about that. People who use meth don't use it alone. They use it with other substances. And you can see other substances used along with it, whether it was use or misuse. You can see that there's a lot of substances being combined with meth. It's often not being used on its own. So drinking, prescription opioids. Cocaine is being used sometimes along with it, and heroin even. Serious mental illness, about 25%, and any mental illness are reported, in the upper 50s in terms of percentage. In terms of methamphetamine associated, we hear a lot about overdose lately, and those obviously are being mostly reported in terms of opioid, but methamphetamine associated overdose deaths among adults in the US has been on the rise. And the data here is presented in meth overdose deaths per 100,000 people, rising from 2.4 to 5 during the period of 2016 to 2019. So clearly, doubling during that period. Meth-associated death rose 46% between November of 18 to October 19, compared to November 19 to October 20. So, again, it's suggesting a rise in deaths. And what's happening here possibly is that the type of meth that I described being used is becoming stronger. We're also noticing that meth is being laced with other things like fentanyl. So there may be meth-associated deaths that have, it's not just the meth alone, but also other substances that might be mixed in like fentanyl. This shows the overdose rate from the National Mortality Statistics from 2020. And I think you'll notice as it goes from 2000, as it goes from 2011 and marches through time, you could see that the shades are getting darker, and they tend to be trending towards the east as time is going on. So that overdose rate is kind of moving eastward. I have this slide in here because a lot of people want to understand kind of what's happening in terms of meth use since COVID. And this shows data from the CDC as of June 2020. 13% of Americans reported starting or increase in substance use as a way of coping with stress related to COVID-19. And you could see, if the declaration of COVID-19 as a national emergency on March 13th in 2020, and in the months following, and this shows the change in drug positivity rates and how they're kind of marching upwards during that month following March of 2020, and that the month that followed that and onward. We can, I think a lot of us have had some experience that people coming in for treatment and use levels rising since COVID started. I'm going to touch on the difference between meth and cocaine. I think that both are stimulants. The difference between meth and cocaine, one of the differences is methamphetamine is man-made versus plant-derived cocaine. Probably the biggest difference is that methamphetamine produces a high that is much more long-lasting than cocaine. So the smoking of meth and its half-life is quite a bit longer, as you can see, from 8 to 16 hours versus 8 to 30 minutes. Now, what that means is people use cocaine differently. Perhaps they may take more puffs over time to keep the high going. Meth, similarly, people will take repeated hits in order to keep the high going, but it just lasts a lot longer. You can imagine someone who's using methamphetamine, that they're going to be awake if they're using it in the evening, they're going to be awake that night. They're not likely to be able to fall asleep having used meth. So this is the half-life is described here. 50% of the drug is eliminated from the body in about 12 hours versus cocaine, where at 50% is eliminated from the body in about an hour. The cost, I don't actually trust what's in here. These are figures, and they range greatly between cities, between parts of different cities, who people are buying from, and all sorts of things. The cost varies greatly. Methamphetamine is relatively inexpensive compared to cocaine in some places. And And as I'm pointing out, it lasts a lot longer. This is another chart showing kind of the price of meth. And again, this is the price that, in looking on the internet and kind of looking at data, these are numbers that kind of I've arrived at looking at data. I actually don't know how accurate these are. How meth is consumed, in order from fastest to slowest effect. So injecting has the quickest effect, about 30 seconds. Smoking is also not so slow. It's actually pretty fast, from 30 to 60 seconds. Snorting, people don't often snort meth. It's that the crystals are sharp. It's uncomfortable to snort, so people don't often snort it that way. Swallowing it, people don't. I don't use it that way that often, but occasionally you'll see people using it. It could also be inserted rectally. That's another way that it's sometimes used. Again, a slower route compared to injecting and smoking. The stages of methamphetamine use, if someone's been using before, they may, even before they begin to use, they may have, they may crave it, and that could be, that craving can be triggered as simply by a thought, some simple visualization, some, a text message, whatever, may kind of get the craving going. It doesn't take a lot to trigger the motivation to use. But even cues relating to meth use may kind of get the dopamine release that I'll be talking about in a moment. And that begins that kind of motivation to use. Tricky business. So, someone gets triggered to use and they begin down that path. Intoxication, meth stimulates large bursts of dopamine in the brain that reinforce drug taking and also strengthens the associations linking the stimuli that preceded the drug consumption with the expectation of the reward, the experience of reward that methamphetamine provides. The high lasting 4 to 12 hours includes a feeling of euphoria, self-confidence, energy, an escape from negative emotions. I think the thing that struck me the most in doing an interview study with people who use meth was them describing, and we often suggest people ask clients to talk about the pros and cons of use. Well, what do you get from it? And they will describe a euphoria like none other. And I think it's important for us to understand that so that we can get a sense of why people use. It seems like it does such damage to their lives and relationships and can cause so many problems. So why are they using? And the euphoria people describe a sense of self-confidence also. Some people who may use an episode can be, a brief use, or it can go on for several days. Following use, what often is referred to as a crash afterwards, and that withdrawal period can last from 1 to 3 days. It can include sleeping, because finally with the meth kind of being processed and leaving the body, and they've been sleep deprived sometimes. Depression, low mood, decreased ability to enjoy things, stress, and the longer the exposure, often kind of the more exaggerated these crash effects can be. I think it's the days following a heavy use period that sometimes we see people in our office because they're having intense anxiety, intense symptoms of depression. Substances used along with meth, GHB, it's taken as a liquid, and it can be seen to kind of enhance the pleasurable effect. Amyl nitrate is also often used, produces a brief euphoria. It can also kind of contribute to an ability to have, let's say, anal intercourse. It could increase the enjoyment of sex. MDMA, or ecstasy, or Molly also can increase feelings of energy and pleasure, and often are used alongside with meth. To counteract the side effects, we'll see people using Viagra or other substances like that, because meth can impair erectile function, and therefore drugs are often used to compensate for that. And then obviously benzodiazepine, Xanax is pretty common, used to kind of help the person on the backside of their period or the episode of use in order to sleep or to come off of the high. In a study, this is a study from Perry Halkidis and his group, data collected from a while back in 2005, and they were looking at substances used by MSMs during the past 4 months in combination with meth, and you could see pretty high proportion of substances being used alongside of meth. Again, it's useful to understand when we're working with people that it's often not just meth that they're using. There are other substances that are part of the package. Important to understand how methamphetamine impacts on the brain. It affects the dopamine system in a couple of ways. One, it stimulates the release of extra dopamine. That reward pathway is getting very high levels of stimulation, but it also prevents neurons from reabsorbing that dopamine. So normally, if there's too much dopamine in that synapse, it would be reabsorbed, and which would allow the levels to go back to normal. But because crystal meth stops that reabsorption, that extra dopamine remains much longer and active in that synapse. So these two factors are what cause that exaggerated dopamine experience, and why meth produces such a profound feeling of euphoria and well-being. You could see this is dopamine levels after food, alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, and then meth. So compared to cocaine, and this is percent of dopamine increase after cocaine, here we have like about a 300% increase, but meth is literally off the chart here. It's very high. Compared to cocaine now, it drops, and people using cocaine and meth may keep that high going over time by taking additional hits of it. But I think it's just useful to understand this huge kind of very powerful dopamine effect of meth. And again, a reason to understand this is that powerful euphoric experiences is really what we're up against when we're talking with people about wanting to change their use. Including these long-term effects of methamphetamine on the brain, loss of dopamine neurons after heavy meth may occur. As many as 50% of the dopamine producing cells in the brain can be damaged after prolonged exposure to meth. So a comparison subject, methamphetamine abuser. This is from Volkov's data from 2001. We've all seen these slides of how meth affects the brain, and I want to be very careful in thinking about this. These are commonly trotted out as, see what meth does to the brain. Someone using, this is over time. This is someone who is using, probably meeting high levels of use to be included in the study, and over a longer period of time. This is not a one-time user or someone who's using sporadically. That's one point I think important. That's very important to make. They do show us data that shows over time that someone who abstains from use over time, that their brain kind of goes back to looking normal, which I think is really important. It does take some time for the brain for someone who's used in a chronic high level pattern. But the important point here is that it does go back to near normal. It does go back to usual patterns. So that's an important point I'll make. A little bit later in this talk, I'm going to I want us to think about the diseased use idea, the diseased brain notion of addiction. And a lot of it's built on data, but like I'm showing you here now. And I think it's useful to be a little critical of this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Patterns of use, many people may use occasionally, say a special event, they're going to circuit parties, clubs, that sort of thing, and never go beyond that place. And I can't tell you kind of what proportion of people are able to kind of use at that level and use and have it never become problematic use. People may even continue and use more and become like a weekend user, and maybe use in terms of in the context of sexual encounters or groups they may meet online, using in that way. And they may never advance to it becoming a problematic pattern of use. It may not interfere with their life, and they may stay there and not continue on. The people we end up seeing in treatment are those for whom using at this level begins to interfere with their work or their relationships, or that it continues to progress to someone who needs to use just to get to work, say, or to get up and to feel normal, they might begin to need to use. And they may kind of enter into kind of a pattern of use where they're using, nearly daily. Often people who begin to use at that level are no longer using for the pleasure of it or are using in the context of sex. They may begin to use more kind of alone and often sometimes just to kind of get their functioning up to normal. So these are sometimes the people we end up seeing in treatment are the ones who are using more heavily, and it becomes a bigger problem in terms of the impact on their life. Short-term effects, I've talked about some of these things, the heightened sex, the increased mood. People will describe feeling more social and increased desire to go out. A very important piece of this is a sense of belonging, feeling connected to other people. In terms of the physical experience of short-term effects, that fight or flight response can be to some degree inactivated. People have a lot of energy, decreased appetite, and difficulty sleeping. That's just one aspect of it. In terms of longer-term effects, depression, some suspiciousness and paranoia, we tend to see that in people who have used perhaps for long periods of time at a higher level. It's not that common, but it does happen. In terms of social withdrawal from relationships, kind of loss of employment and financial issues. In terms of physical long-term effects, dental problems, the amphetamine is really causing dry mouth, and that's what's creating some of the problems with dental issues. Weight loss, we see that some people can develop some intense sores on their skin that they'll itch and pick at. And then, of course, people may, in the course of using, and I'll talk about this in a bit, in terms of different STDs, HIV, for example, being one of those, is something that we've seen as a result of long-term use. I was part of a study here at Columbia. We were interviewing HIV positive men who had sex with men with either a past or current methamphetamine use disorder. And it was interesting to learn about, we asked them questions about their kind of use. Interesting how many people reported that their first use, 94% reported that it was unplanned, that they didn't go seeking methamphetamine, that it happened more spontaneously. A lot of people described they were on one of the social apps, Grindr or Scruff or one of those, met up with someone, and person said, have you ever smoked this? Give it a try. It's great. And they tried it. 51% reported that they knew nothing about meth before their use. 57% said that sex was their reason for initial use. A lot of other people described that maybe they were using, or they used to go partying or go dancing, something like that. 44% were using a smartphone app for a hookup at that initial use. So that seems to be a real way that people are connecting and able to find meth pretty readily. In terms of continued use, 80% said sex was a reason for continued use. Again, the heightened confidence, the reward system being activated. People will describe that the sex they have on meth is very different than sex without. 29% said they used to increase self-confidence and self-esteem. We could understand how that would be mixed in with a drive for sex and a need for sex and feeling confident in while having sex. 24% obtained meth through hookups or exchange for sex. We asked people how they were paying for it. It's not cheap. And a lot of people said they never had to pay for it, that they would just hook up with people who were willing to provide it. And some actually exchanged meth for sex. 11% became dealers in order to pay. Unfortunately, people whose use patterns begin to impact on their ability to work and make money in order to sustain their habit. Some began to deal. Other consequences, 89% reported at least one negative consequence of their meth use. 68% reported getting an STD. For example, HIV and Hep C were included in the STDs reported. Almost half reported losing a relationship, 39% lost a job. And of course, that would be, one could imagine that might be associated with losing an apartment. 9% had significant psychiatric problems. Like we heard people reporting about psychotic symptoms. In order to understand the relationship between meth and MSMs, I've read this book by David Fawcett that I think is actually really useful to think about how to work with men who are using, gay men who are using meth, and guiding us in how to help them, direct them towards recovery. The appeal for MSMs, that escape from uncomfortable feelings, and I think I cannot kind of say with more emphasis how shame plays into that. For MSMs in particular, living a lifetime where they may feel kind of out as outsiders, to be able to escape that, I think that shame can also come along with what it means to be HIV positive, for example, and the stigma that's attached to that. That if you could just erase those feelings and one's negative relation to sex even, to have those just go away and have your confidence be kind of heightened, then this is one could perhaps better understand why people get involved with meth. A sense of worth and belonging. People will often have described that they develop maybe a community of people that they hang out with, they feel connection with, and that meth has contributed to that. So that isolation that gay men often describe, now with meth, they may kind of have feelings of connection that they didn't have otherwise. Important to understand the many aspects that may contribute to that sense of isolation. Multiple oppressed identities can impact on self-esteem, mental health, and well-being, whether it's race and ethnicity, social economic status, gender identity, sexual orientation, HIV status, clearly age, language, acculturation. All these issues may contribute to how we feel about ourselves as people, our mental health. And these are the aspects that I think we need to really take into account when we're working with this population and thinking about why they might use, what function it serves in their life to use, because we need to understand that if we're going to help them change their relation to the substance, we need to understand what's keeping it in place, what function has it served. So I think we need to keep all of these things in mind. It's not easy when confronted with all the negative aspects that we see, the negative impact on our clients' lives from meth use. It's hard to try to think about kind of what positive purpose did it serve? What positive aspect did it have to their life? Obviously a lot, otherwise they wouldn't have gotten involved with it. David Fawcett, he spends a lot of time, and I think it's really useful to understand the connection between the sex-enhancing properties of meth and how it facilitates the connection in the brain between the drug and an intensive sexual experience. When we're working with this population and someone wants to reduce their meth use and they've used it in the context of sex, we're no longer just going to be treating a substance use disorder. We're going to be treating a sexual use issue because they become connected. That dopamine response, which creates a strong connection between sex and meth use, over time they become inseparable. What fires together wires together is the quote. I had a close friend who began using meth and it became a problem for him. And he said very clearly at one point, I will never have sex without meth. It just does not, I can't even imagine it, he said. That's tricky if he wanted to, and he did want to stop using meth. So what about sex then? What do we do with that? And we can't ignore it. It's something that we have to incorporate in when working with these patients. Part of, and as these things become intertwined, sexual desire and behavior can become obsessive in a way. Sex triggers the desire to use meth, and then meth triggers the desire for sex. So they become in this way that they become kind of wired together. We have to address them together. I just included this slide which talks about MSM and meth, and it's so easy to find meth in New York City. I think within 20 minutes, someone could be at someone's house and it's available. Just getting on one of the apps, finding someone who puts in their headline party and play or P&P. They tend to use a capital T as a signal to someone that Tina will be involved. So it's very easy for people to get connected. The reason why I'm bringing this up is if we're working with someone who wants to change their use pattern, we're probably going to have to do something about their the fact that they have this app on their phone, and at any minute they might be getting a text or message from someone saying, come hang out. In David Fawcett's book, he talks about meth's impact on sexual behavior. People will describe that their inhibitions are reduced, and impulse control can be diminished. Fantasies can become real behavior. I want to be careful that often that can be a positive thing. That's not always a bad thing. That can be a positive thing. Same with more sex partners. People who want to have sex and enjoy it, they may have access to more sex partners. It may increase their confidence and ability to have sex more often. People describe that they're interested in pushing their personal limits in terms of the behaviors they'll engage in. Again, we have to mind our judgment here and be careful with the way we think about this. Those are not necessarily bad things unless it leads to decisions that may impact on their health. And that's where we have to be wondering about the intersection of meth and sex and the fact that it may impact on people's decision-making in a direction they don't ultimately want it to go. In terms of impact on performance, people will kind of engage in because the heightened desire will kind of engage in sexual, what people describe as sex marathons lasting for many hours or sometimes even days. And I mentioned before the erectile dysfunction that is a topic that comes up sometimes. I've talked now, I showed you the slides from Nora Volkov with the brain images. And I've also talked about, in David Fawcett's book, the social situation that can lead to a meth use disorder. We need to think about whether it's a brain disease or is it just bad choices that people are making. And I think this book by Gene Heyman is a very interesting book, and it talks about, he makes the argument that we should really frame it as an addiction, framing addiction as a choice and not that it's just a brain disease. We need to kind of move it out of that framework. Then he makes the argument that some of which I've made, many people have a substance use problem and never seek treatment. He also argues that normal choice processes are at the basis of drug misuse. People don't choose to become dependent on substances. They may make choices that kind of over time lead to addiction. And perhaps we ought to think about it in those terms. When someone comes to me and they have a use issue, it's useful to using Prochaska and De Clemente's model of change to notice where they are in terms of their preparation to change, their readiness to change. Are they not even ready to contemplate it? Are they thinking about changing? And locating them somewhere in this might help us better address where they are in their readiness to make some change. Strategies for motivational interviewing. Here we want to be really careful about the language we use and how we approach this. Motivational interviewing, it gives us a particular stance, and it begins with the assumption that the responsibility and capability for change lie within the client. In other words, it's not the diseased brain, but the choices lie within the client. And I think sometimes we need to kind of move in that direction. Our task is to create conditions that will enhance the client's motivation for and commitment to change. I gave some do's here: empathy, rolling with the resistance. The do nots are also important: not to criticize, judge, warn of all the negative consequences, but instead to explore with them their understanding of what some of the consequences might be. To try to persuade someone with logic or evidence is not really going to move them further along that stage of change model. In fact, it may make them more resistant. And I think we have to be careful not to corner someone and deepen their resistance. When sitting with someone, I will often ask them, what are the pros and cons of their use, just to understand what some of the positive aspects are for them, so I know what they're up against. If they're going to give up meth, what are they giving up? Great sex, connection with people, all those things. We need to understand what they will be giving up. Also, what they will be gaining, obviously, if they decide to change their use patterns, and understand the ambivalence about their changing. And it's kind of in understanding their ambivalence that we might help them move towards the longer term goals they have, and moving in that direction. I often will make a change plan with them, talking about the changes they want to make, why they want to make them, what specific steps they can take to change. An example might be delete those hookup apps, abstain from sex for a period of time, even changing their phone number so people can't get in touch with them. There are lots of ways, connecting with old networks of people that didn't use. Those are all ways. I'm going to kind of jump over some of these things. Other behavioral treatments, CBT, contingency management, matrix model, all are successful at helping people move. Difficult to know which one is the best. The data is kind of tricky, but I think a lot of people are suggesting that these behavioral treatments, they are effective. There are medication treatments for meth. There have been lots of studies trying out different medications to try to treat addiction. That might be more of a disease brain idea, that if we can find that silver bullet, we'll be able to treat methamphetamine use. I'm going to just, here are the different studies, and these will be part of the slide set. I think what I really want to do is just point out, in the most successful study to date, and it's one of the bigger, more powerful trials, the outcome, it was a combination of naltrexone and bupropion, 13.6% versus 2.5%, who were in the placebo group, met the primary outcome of negative urines. So while it is significant, it is not hugely successful. And I think we have to, we're still looking for for medications that might help. I think the conclusion is behavioral treatments will be what will be effective, perhaps someday in combination with some medication that will support them. I will stop there and take some questions from people.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Martin. We do have a couple of questions, and please utilize the Q&A pod if you do have other questions. So for our first question, we have, how strong is the effect in someone who has bipolar disorder?
How strong is the effect of meth? I don't know that it would be different than someone who has bipolar disorder. I think that I think it's interesting. There's some question of whether using an amphetamine, using a stimulant, might actually there's some argument that it may bump people into a manic episode, or, I showed you kind of the ups and downs, the crash that occurs when someone's using meth, that someone with a bipolar disorder, they may already have a tendency to have elevated moods during either a manic or hypomanic episode, and then depressed moods. And what I've seen is sometimes people who use meth, they may be using meth to kind of treat their depression sometimes, but it may set the wave of their emotional instability going. Let me put it this way. I don't think using meth helps smooth out someone's bipolar disorder. I think if anything, it may exaggerate the fluctuations of mood that occur. Now, I'm just saying this from my personal experience. I think it might make some sense that people who have either depression or bipolar disorder might be attracted to meth, because it might actually help treat their depression, if you will. So I think we have to understand why people might be drawn towards meth, because they may be to some degree self-medicating with the meth to kind of treat against the depressions that they have. But it does, I don't think it necessarily has a differing effect, but I think it may, people may be attracted to using meth who have either depressions or have bipolar disorder.
Thank you. And we have another question. It's actually a two-part question. Okay. The first part is, are there any additional physical health consequences for patients who use meth rectally? And the second part of that is, what are some of the potential risks with this type of use? An
interesting question. I think that kind of inserting meth in the rectum, what do I want to say here? I think I'm just going to say from what I've heard people tell me, and not data that I'm presenting, but I've heard people describe that it can be uncomfortable, that it can cause some irritation. We might worry that if someone's then going to have anal sex, that they've already have an irritation there. I've heard of irritation. I would imagine that a medical doctor might be able to kind of talk about what they've seen in terms of real issues there that might occur of using it rectally. There's a second part to that question I feel like I'm not answering. Yeah, the second part is, what are some of the potential risks of this type of use, using it rectally? I guess just what I'm saying, the irritation to the rectal tissue would be kind of what I would imagine. Again, it's how people use it may differ in terms of kind of how they actually apply it. But I don't know that it's not that common that people use it that way, and I think that's for a reason. I do think that it's not comfortable. I think that the high may take a little longer, so it's not as popular to use that way. But I don't know that much about it. It's not that many people. I think of the 100 people we surveyed, I think there are 2 people who said that they used it that way. And they didn't use that often. I think if someone's using very often, and that's the route, their preferred route, we could imagine that it might cause damage to the rectal tissue. But that's all I could. Yeah. Okay, and that was actually the last question. If anyone has another question, we have a minute. You can drop it in the chat or the Q&A pod. Sorry about that.
Well, thank you very much for the very informative discussion today. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for coming the Friday before a holiday weekend. So it was a great attendance, a great talk, and everybody have a fabulous weekend. Thank you again. And please don't forget to fill out your evaluations.
Happy holiday.
Happy holidays.
Bye, guys.